Rock on. Good morning, everyone. I am going to share my PowerPoint. Looks like we have Matt joining us. We are going to be a small but mighty group, it sounds like. So I want you to feel totally comfortable with putting your voice in the room. If you have a question, don't feel like you're interrupting the flow. I really want you to get your questions answered while we're here today. So I am Trisha Shrode. I am the Director of Research and Evaluation for Midwest PBIS. I've been here officially 1 year as of the 14th of August. Previous to that, I was the Director of Curriculum and Instruction in School District U46, which is the second largest school district in the state of Illinois, where I oversaw MTSS and therefore PBIS for our 57 school programs. But previous to that, I was a principal in Chicago, Illinois, on the south and west side. But I started my journey with PBIS as a middle school mathematics teacher on the south side of Peoria, where I'm from. So I believe that I bring the benefit of having been a teacher practitioner of PBIS, a building level administrator of PBIS, and then a district level administrator of PBIS, as well as kind of that research and eval frame when we think about positive behaviors, interventions, and supports, as well as MTSS overall. I have that academic and behavioral experience, which I hope that you find benefit to your practice. I work for the Midwest PBIS network, which is a hub of the center, right? So the center is national technical assistance partnership funded by the Department of Ed. And what is incredibly helpful about that is, as practitioners, we bring problems of practice to the center related to installation of social and emotional and behavioral supports for students and adults. And they do research in the field in that area to help bolster our need. And so I've appreciated continuously the center's work, even during the last 18 months, to provide additional resources for teachers, practitioners across the board to help us better support our adults and therefore better support kids. So here's how we're going to start this morning. It's a Monday morning. You guys just finished summer school, which was my jam for the last 15 years, overseeing summer school, super amazing. I want you in chat to share your name, your role in your district, and then identify which of these images you most identify with this Monday morning, and add what your caption bubble would say aligned to your clip art, okay? Name, role, identify your image, and add your caption. Ooh, I've got one in so far. Matt, it's good to meet you. Thank you, Cindy. Charlie Brown, there's not enough time before the school year starts, right? Oh, look at you, Lori. On a Monday morning, no less. Look at you. I'm this coffee cup over here because I'm on my second iced coffee of the morning. I might have gotten a talking to from my 22-year-old about the amount of caffeine I consume in any given day. Casey, what would your yoga person say, Casey? Are you getting in your Zen space? Stay calm. Thank you very much. I hope that we can all get into a Zen headspace. In fact, if you'd like some help thinking about helping your adults take care of self, don't forget we have self-care this afternoon, actually, if you have availability. So I'll watch the chat to see if anybody else kind of claims their clip art, but I want to get us into the learning today. So no matter which clip art character you are, I hope that we can all just take a deep breath together on this Monday morning and acknowledge, especially given the triple trauma of the last 18 months, you know, the pandemic, social unrest, the implications of the election, the ongoing concerns that we have. I know that in New York, much like in Illinois, where I'm stationed, the issues around masking and vaccinate, there's a lot that is on our plate as we engage in this work this year. And we should just acknowledge how we are feeling and take care of ourselves. I know as leaders, we often are so worried about those that we support that we forget to take care of self. I would assert that if I was trying to be the glass half full, right, person, that certainly the last 18 months of our lives have benefited us, I would assert, in the following ways. More than ever, we are focused on social and emotional learning. More than ever, as families have tried to provide support to kids, and as we think about schools in general, there is a much stronger focus on social and emotional learning as well as mental health. And an understanding, I know you all had an understanding that many of our kids were coming from trauma backgrounds, but now more than ever, given the last 18 months, the implications of trauma on the school and our students is again at the forefront. And so we're going to see that as a silver lining, because where there is a spotlight, where people are paying attention, there are generally additional resources allocated to help support us. So I know that I don't, because you all are here, even after engaging in summer school, getting ready for the school year, I have to understand and believe that you absolutely understand the golden question of the why, right? We come every day and do this amazing work for the benefit of kids. When I was asked to present this whole concept of how do we better align our work, take all of those things that we're doing and put them into a frame so that teachers and administrators don't feel like we're being asked to do one more thing when we don't feel like we can possibly do the things that we're already being asked to do, I was excited, frankly, because the idea of multi-tiered systems of support really does give us a frame to kind of align the initiatives like restorative practices that Jay mentioned when we first entered, like trauma-informed care. It helps us make sense of this work for our adults so that we can support students to become socially and emotionally competent and academically achieving, which has always been my why, right? All the work that we do towards school improvement is about helping support adults and systems. That's what, when I say systems, I'm really talking about the adults, for the betterment of kids so that they can be socially and emotionally competent and academically achieving. And we do that through data, systems, and practice, right? We use data to inform our work. We engage in research-based practices. We improve our systems and support our adults to get to our outcome, which is socially and emotionally competent and academically achieving youth. So I mentioned MTSS. For those of you who've been at this for a while, right, we used to call the academic portion of this RTI, response to intervention, and many of us addressed social and emotional behavioral learning through positive behaviors interventions and supports. MTSS really is the sweet spot, right, where academics and behavior come together under the 3-tiered medical model, which is where MTSS comes from, right? And the overlap between old school academic RTI and social emotional behavioral learning through PBIS is that they are both team-based and led, right? You have to have teams to do this work. None of you all can do this on your own. We have to engage in scientifically based interventions in both the academic realm and the social and emotional behavioral realm. We have to have a three-tiered model. In fact, we have to be implementing that three-tiered model with fidelity of practice. If we're not installing universal MTSS, we will over-identify for tiers 2 and tier 3, and we don't have the resources to address large groups at tier 2 and tier 3. As I mentioned when we were talking data systems and practice, we have to use multiple methods of data collection and analysis to inform our ongoing system. We have to have comprehensive universal screening in both academic and behavioral. We're going to talk a little bit about what we have in place now and not adding another thing if we're not actually engaged in universal screening yet. And then the ongoing job-embedded professional development that's necessary for adults to move their practice, right? So I mentioned the three-tiered model, and I mentioned that we would really benefit from thinking through all of the initiatives that we're engaged in through a framework so that it doesn't feel like one more thing. And I'm sure in New York, you did not make the mistake that we made in U46 in Illinois, where we brought in trauma-informed care and weren't really intentional about trauma work. And so people felt like it was a replacement for what we were doing, right? Like, oh, we're trauma-informed now, we're not doing PBIS. Or, oh, we've been trained in RP now, we're not doing PBIS. As opposed to thinking about PBIS as the overall frame and MTSS to align the groups that we have, right? Engaging in universal behavioral lesson plans, development of expectations, teaching of those expectations, and layering on supports. We know how to align those, right, within a three-tiered model. But all of our initiatives actually fit under the frame of MTSS, every single one of them. You throw one to me in chat and I'll talk to you about where it fits in the pyramid, right? That restorative practices that Jay was talking about, having additional sessions, right, as a booster on Wednesday, restorative practices actually sits at several tiers, right? If you're engaged in circles in each of your classrooms, right, we have a morning meeting, etc. That's a universal practice. That's a practice that teachers can engage in with their students to develop relationship and rapport at the tier 1 universal level. Restorative practices can actually also sit at the tier 2 level, right? If a student's needs are not being met at the classroom and they need to be referred to the office for additional levels of support through an office discipline referral, the administrator, the dean, the AP, etc., might engage in a restorative conversation with a student and try to repair harm, right? But restorative practices doesn't replace MTSS. Instead, it teaches our adults skills and strategies to help support students at each of the tiers of the three-tiered model. Does that make sense? So whether it be trauma-informed, whether it be social emotional learning, whether it be academic, right? Academic curriculum at the tier 1 level would be the curriculum I teach in my biology classroom every day. The academic content of tier 2 might look like an academic seminar class at my high school that students who need an additional level of support receive, right? But all of these can find a home on the framework of MTSS in the three-tiered model. So I mentioned that this comes from the medical model, right? We give credit where credit is due. And the medical model is really set up very similarly. You'll see very similar word choice, right? At universal level, we have programs that target the entire population, much like when we look at the universal PBIS MTSS pyramid, the first tier is really about what all kids have access to. That secondary tier is programs targeted at families that have need to alleviate additional problems, much like in an MTSS tier. If kids meet needs are not being met at the universal tier, we might layer on a support like check-in, check-out, or layer on a support like social academic instructional group, or layer on an academic support like hooking a reading block with an English class for students who need additional support in language arts. And then that tertiary level, whether we're using the PBIS MTSS frame or the public health pyramid, is really targeted, individualized supports for people who haven't had their needs met, even with Fidelity's implementation of primary and secondary tiers. If we look at this through more of a Maslow's pyramid, right? Certainly after the last year and a half together, we really need to think about Maslow's hierarchy of need, right? Are our basic needs being met, whether that be food, water, or just safety, right? But we have to get under the hood of that Maslow's pyramid and think about what we can install as we think about how we return this fall, right? And I'm going to show you a few resources that might be helpful to your practice. We're going to talk about what this would look like within the school. But we certainly know that, right? We talked about this as far as our silver linings, that there's been an absolute spotlight on mental health and social and emotional learning for schools and our community, given what we faced the last 18 months. That there has been such an increased uptick in anxiety, depression, and trauma that we have to engage in really high quality MTSS PBIS practices, because historically, right, 1/3 of our students in our classrooms have come from a trauma background, have 3 or more ACEs. But given the occurrences of the last 18 months, think about within your own school what your adults and students have faced over the last 18 months and the increase of anxiety, depression, etc. Now more than ever, I'm going to ask you over our 2 hours together this morning to really focus on your systems that you already have in place and think about how you could reinforce those research-based systems to help address the needs of your students, staff, and the families in your current context, and continuously use data to inform that practice. Use your data to outline what your initial teaching plan will look like. Use your data to judge whether that plan is working or not, right? Not just the outcome data that says, oh yeah, as we're installing this, kids and adults are benefiting, but also the data on whether you're fidelidously installing what you said you were going to do. Because if you don't fidelidously install, you won't get improved outcomes. So it's not just about outcome data, right? It's about fidelity data, perception data. But ultimately, given the last 18 months, this whole idea of prevention and intervention at the first sign is going to be more important than it ever has been as we enter together. And that idea of relationships and connectedness has to undergird all of the work that we do this year. So I'm certain that I'm singing to the choir, and much of this data, right, won't be news to you. But I just wanted to nest our current context into the context that we were facing before we left the buildings and began crisis teaching on March 13th of 2020, which isn't even 2 years ago, and then went through the roller coaster ride, right, that was last school year, as well as this summer, and then thinking through what we're doing to get ready for this fall, right? So I'm not going to read you these statistics, but overall, right, mental health as a condition has impacted our school, and it has grown exponentially because this was all pre-COVID data, and now we're talking since COVID. In fact, right, when we think about a mental health related visit between April and October of last year, so in the height of the pandemic, the mental health related visits for children between the age of 5 and 17 increased almost a third when compared with the same time period of a year before. So we were already struggling, right, serving the needs of students that had mental health, that were in need of social, emotional, behavioral, mental health supports. The impact of COVID certainly increased that drastically, increased the rates of depression, anxiety, which impacted us, right, with kids struggling with cognitive functioning, exhaustion. But we're not just talking about kids, right? When we were supporting educators, we were seeing high levels of anxiety, high levels of exhaustion and burnout. In fact, when we talk to our adults in our organization about self-care, sometimes we got pushback about self-care, right? You're asking me to do one more thing when I already feel like I'm drowning. I just don't know how I even take care of self when I'm barely treading water. I love visuals, right? Much more than words, because it helps us see what we're talking about. So if we have a framework already in place, if you've been installing MTSS with a level of fidelity, you have something to hang this work on, if you will, right? If you don't have MTSS solidly installed, we have more work to do. That's when we begin to feel overwhelmed. That's when, if we look at that pyramid that I show you where we layered in initiatives, if we're not being intentional about how we bring initiatives like restorative practices, like trauma-informed care, like social emotional learning, then it begins to feel overwhelming because it's one more thing I have to do, as opposed to one more tool in my toolkit that helps support me installing MTSS with kids. So I hope that you see and will see throughout our limited time together that MTSS really gives us the framework, right, to hang this work on. Our school team, our use of data, our ongoing coaching and support, the use of effective implementations, all of that gives us a frame to start from. We're not starting from scratch. Because as Jay and I were joking before we let you all in from the waiting room, right? If there were quick fixes, we would have already done it, right? We also know that one of those quick fixes, even though there is quite a bit of money being funneled into our school systems over the last year and a half, we cannot just hire more people. One, because we can't find enough qualified people, right? And two, we've tried that before, right? You've written grants, you've gotten more Title I money. If you don't work on your system, your staff that is currently in place and your practices, it doesn't matter how many people that you hire, you will not get better outcomes. So we can't hire our way out of it, right? We also can't buy, and again, I know I'm singing to the choir, we can't buy our way out of it, right? When these additional funds come, it doesn't matter whether we're installing Second Step or whether we're buying a cool, really online learning management system. You insert the thing we could purchase. If we buy another thing, but don't have the support of adults through training, technical assistance, professional development, they won't be able to install the new thing, and we won't get the benefits that the salesperson told us we would get, right? We have to use our data, our knowledge of our system, and our framework to do good work with what we have. I mentioned trauma. I'm going to mention again later. Jay mentioned restorative practices. None of them on their own is enough. In fact, it's super helpful to know about trauma. It's super helpful to know that some of our kids are engaged in fight, flight, and freeze in our classroom, and what that might look in our classroom is different than what might look at home. All of those are helpful. All of those can be beneficial to our practice. But just having that thing, trauma-informed, restorative, growth mindset, etc., is not enough if we don't have a framework that includes evaluation of what we're doing, coaching of the adults, and ongoing support and data. So what I'm hoping that you come away with from today, this time together on Monday, August 16th, or whether you're watching this video at a later date, is that social, emotional, behavioral work is everyone's job, right? It's not just teachers. It's not just you as administrators. It's not just clinicians. It's not just families. It's the lunch staff, the security guard, the front office clerks. Everyone has to work together as we return to school to create a safe, consistent, caring environment where we don't stigmatize people for asking for the help that they need, where we all look for warning signs in children and adults, and that we embed social, emotional, behavioral competencies in all aspects of the curriculum, and that all staff are pulling in the same direction. We have to break down silos of service delivery. We have to break them down within our school walls. So as I mentioned, all of us have to pull in the same direction. Your cafeteria manager, your security guard, your front office clerk, your counselor, your teacher, we all have to work together towards common goals, towards common expectations. We also have to break down the silos between us and our social safety net, our community-based safety net, our community mental health providers, our families. We all have to work together now more than ever to support the social, emotional, behavioral needs of the youth that we serve. So what have we learned, right? We did some of this last year, whether we were returning to remote, returning to hybrid, returning to in-person. As I mentioned, my last school district in the state of Illinois, School District U46, had 5 different instructional models last year, had a mix of all of the things that I just mentioned. And we saw that across the nation, right? We had some districts that stayed totally remote, or a goodly portion of them. We had some districts that had some remote and some hybrid. We had some districts that went back in person, and any mix of those across that school year. We saw huge variability. We absolutely understand that not just during crisis teaching, which was really the spring of 2020, but throughout last year, we had very mixed experiences related to distance learning. You had districts that had trouble because families didn't have access to internet. Not everyone had a device. Teachers who were distinguished in their practice historically in their classroom were now being asked to move online and were not prepared. And we offered ongoing PD to the best of our ability, but we still had very different experiences across our schools last year. We absolutely learned, right, that mental health was everyone's role. And we saw this in really innovative ways in schools across the nation, where deans that were no longer handling office discipline referrals were actually reaching out to families, going door to door, and really engaging in very different roles because we had to, right? We absolutely learned over the last 18 months that resilience and wellness are things that we could teach. In theory, we knew that, and we talked about that before, but in practice, we started doing that over the last 18 years. The last 2 bullets, we have known for decades about the impact of relationships. In fact, those of us who know brain research, right, know the impact on relationships and building resiliency. But the last 18 months have reinforced those messages, right? This is not new to us. So one of the products that I think has been most helpful as I've worked with districts, right, is returning to school during and after a crisis. It was put out last school year. We took additional feedback, had additional questions from districts, and it was re-released with updates in March of last year, as well as briefs that were put out by the center. that talk about the implications of post-pandemic schooling, right? That we need to focus on relationships, that we need to prioritize mental health and wellness, that we actually have to go back to the basics and make sure we're really doing what we said we're going to do around universal practices, and really engage in a less is more approach. And I would imagine that you'll hear me say the word relationships 24 times or more in this 2 hours together. But part of the reason I'm doing that is because as we've learned together this last year, right? And as James Comer has stated for quite a while, no significant learning occurs without significant relationship. And that has been proven true more than ever. Let's talk about our paths through crisis recovery, right? So the resources like the one I just mentioned, returning to school after a crisis, another helpful resource that's linked in this PowerPoint. In fact, when Jay sends you this PowerPoint, you'll see that each of these is linked. But the resources that have been designed to support educators, whether they're getting started or strengthening and maintaining their practice, we really need to think through our implementation of MTSS and PBIS through these paths of crisis recovery. And I almost feel like this needs to be circular in nature, right? Because given the last 18 months together, we have to keep going back to the drawing board as we encounter things like the Delta variant, right? I have to imagine that many of us in the spring of last year really believed that as the vaccines were rolling out and we were getting encouraging news, that we would be engaged in a very different school year this fall. But you all have had to continuously reassess what this year is going to look like. And I absolutely believe, right, that that's going to continue throughout this school year as we continue to confront very real obstacles in our path. So absolutely, as we return this fall, and we're struggling with the families that are concerned about wearing masks, as well as the families that are fighting against wearing masks, as well as the families that have decided and are asking to continue to be remote or remove their kiddos from school because they're concerned. We absolutely, right, as a first step, have to engage in ensuring physical and emotional safety for all students, all staff, and continue to over communicate, which communication, right, has always been an edge of growth, if you will, as we work within schools. As we stabilize, as we enter the school year, as we get kids in their desks and teachers in their rooms, right, we have to continuously prioritize overall staff wellness so that adults are having their needs met and therefore can invest in positive, predictable school climate in the classroom. So if we're just getting started, we're going to start installing Tier 1. But most of you, right, have been doing PBIS, and it's really, again, about really going back to the basics and making certain that we strongly focus on Tier 1 efforts at the beginning of this school year. And when I say Tier 1 efforts, that includes mental health supports. After we get teachers and students in the door, in their desks, in their classrooms, then we continue to invest in Tier 1 practices using our data. So we're installing Tier 1, even if we've been at PBIS for a while, we absolutely need to go back to the basics and make sure that we're supporting adults and kids as they enter our school and over communicating with our families. And we're going to use our data to improve our Tier 1 and then start to layer in Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports. And then as we go through the year, right, we're going to continue to adjust based on our data. Overall, this year more than ever, right, our recommendations are to highly invest in the core elements of PBIS and MTSS overall at Tier 1. You're going to get your biggest bang for your buck at Tier 1. that we prioritize equity. And so when we're looking at our data points, we're looking at who it's working for and who it's not working for, that those student outcomes have to be central to all of our decisions, that, again, because we're going back to the basics and focusing on universal, we want to implement the smallest number of effective practices that get us the most outcome, right? So we might need to actually cull back, slow down before we speed up, and then continue to invest in systems, which means we continue to invest in adults, the ongoing job embedded support that they need so that they can get kids what they need. I want to, again, we had the silver lining, right? What did the last 18 months teach us? It put a spotlight on the importance of social, emotional, behavioral, right? But when we think through this idea of the last year, right? Let's focus on what kids have learned over the last year, right? Many of our kids and our adults have learned a lot of new technology skills, right? What new experiences have they learned to manage, both adults and students? What curricular content, and I know all of us did this, right? We had to kind of move back and say, we're not going to be able to hit all of our curricular content this year. So how do we prioritize? But what do we want to keep from the last 18 months? What really benefited our practice that we should continue to do this year? So one thing that we know, right? We know many things, but one thing that we know is that research shows that if teachers believe in kids and have higher expectations for kids, they have better outcomes. This has been proven. Joe Bowler has done a lot of work around this with mathematics. This is Carol Dweck's work around growth mindset, right? When teachers have a high bar with support for kids, right? High expectation, high support environments, kids really benefit. So while I'm saying go back to the basics and focus on tier one, I'm not talking about remediation, skill and drill, right? We really have to focus on how we're prioritizing standards this year at the same time that we're focused on social and emotional behavioral, but that doesn't mean we lower the bar. It means we have to have a high support, high expectation environment. And that in universal, where we're going to spend the bulk of our time this year, is where we're going to get the most bang for the buck. But we still have to, for those of us who've been installing MTSS, have higher levels of support for some and few, not just kids, right? Adults. Think about it through the lens of when we left the schools in March of 2020, right? It wasn't just kids who needed, higher levels of support. It was adults, right? Adults that had never taught online before, adults who'd never learned a learning management system, adults who didn't know how to use Zoom or Google Meets or you insert the blank, right? We have to continue to think through the logic of all, some, and few, not just for students, but also for adults. I mentioned as we looked at those stages of crisis, right, that we have to prioritize a culture of wellness. You all work at most of you work at the building level. So you're promoting that culture of wellness for your adults and yourself, and they can then take that into the classroom. And then that would then cascade all the way down to the level of students. In fact, I've linked in the PowerPoint that returning to school during and after a crisis, which gives us additional strategies for how we support a culture of wellness across our school, our classrooms, and for the benefit of our students. Thank you, Jay, for that mention, right? This isn't just at the school level. In fact, we should add, if we're thinking about your schools, not just state district school, but state district community school classroom student. How do we reinforce this message within our communities? So another resource that's been linked in the PowerPoint that Jay will have access and I'm sure post with the video is building that culture of staff wellness. So I'm not just asking you to help prioritize staff wellness with yourself and your staff. I'm providing resources for how do we get there? Because we talked a lot about wellness last year and self-care. We put it in our staff newsletters that we sent home. We had it as part of our staff meeting. But again, if it becomes one more thing that the adults have to do, as opposed to something that we embed when we meet with them at our back to school PD, or meet with them at our school improvement meeting, or meet with them at our grade level meeting, where we install these practices through a multi-tiered system of support. So we all know that we have to engage in social, emotional, behavioral learning, right? We know that. We've watched the news. We've lived this in our school buildings. But sometimes we feel like we have to do another thing as opposed to go back to the basics with the things that we already have. So one of the things that I've linked as a resource, as you think about how you bring this back to staff, how this might be of benefit to your practice, is this technical guide for alignment initiatives of practices in schools. And I'm actually going to click there. I hope. Let me see. I might have to stop sharing for a moment because I want to pull it up. There we go. I'm going to download the file. Bear with me for just a moment. I'm going to share my screen again. And someone, Lori or Cynthia or someone, give me a shout if you don't see my screen. It should. Thank you so much, Lori. It should say a technical guide for alignment of initiatives, right? I see some head nodding. So again, this is linked in your PowerPoint. I'm going to roll down. So here's the alignment process. So as you think about entering with staff this fall, I'm asking you to go back to the basics, right? And don't add, but instead look at your current practices, what you currently have installed. One of the things that's super helpful, and it's linked in the PowerPoint available to you. If you have trouble finding it, you'll have Jay give me a shout. But look at number 3 in that alignment process. I think that's at the school level where the rubber meets the road, right? So what are you presently doing? What are the initiatives that were begun, that were installed all of last year? Number 3, develop an inventory. Who is involved in that? Who is it supposed to benefit? Who is it supposed to impact? What data are you using to judge success? What data are you using to make certain that you're really doing that thing that was one of your priorities? And I know that sounds simple, but how many of you all, if you're on camera, can you give me a thumbs up if you've been working in or with schools for 5 years or more? 5 years or more, give me a thumbs up. How about 10 years or more? Okay, we're staying up. So you've seen this, right? You have absolutely seen us bring initiatives into a school or a group of schools or a district or a community partner, right? You bring in an initiative. I'm saying that with air quotes, right? Because we have a kickoff at our Fall Institute, PD Day, whatever you call it. And we got a new book or we got a new speaker and we have a plan and we give everyone a copy of the plan. But then 6 months down the road, you walk into any of your schools, your district office, your community partner, and you ask 10 individuals in that building about the initiative, and you don't get 10 responses that support that you're doing what you said you're going to do, right? So there's this great slide that sometimes we use in training that shows the initiative implementation window, the dip that happens. We say we're doing something, we have a kickoff, we buy stuff, we bring in people that are from 1,000 miles away, and then 6 months later, 12 months later, we kick something new off. And then 6 months later, 12 months later, it either goes with a new requirement by the state legislator, or a new superintendent that comes into your organization, right? We have a lot of things that we say we're doing on paper that don't get into the black box of teaching within our schools. So one of the things that I think we benefit from when we do an inventory of our current initiatives is we talk about what we said we're doing, and then we monitor whether we really are doing what we said we're going to do, who it's supposed to impact, what data we're collecting. Because frankly, we don't want to add one more thing this year. We want to do the things that we said we're doing better, right, for the benefit of kids. So this is, as I mentioned, I'm going to stop sharing for a minute so I can get back to my PowerPoint. Hot linked in this PowerPoint, and Jay has a copy, we'll have a copy of this PowerPoint to post, but certainly that initiative inventory would be super helpful as you're thinking about how do we continuously improve in our school by first really agreeing to what we're working on this year and then actively doing what we said we're going to do. So let me go back to sharing, and the great Lori or Cynthia or Jay. Oh, I'm sharing the article again here. Let me go out. I love when we record and I have technical difficulties. There we go. Not that we have ever had technical difficulties during a video, I'm sure. Okay, back to our alignment. There we go. So when I ask us to think about our current initiatives, it's because I want us to get here, this magic yolk of an egg, if you will, which is one social emotional academic framework. I want you all to take your trauma-informed practices, your safety practices, your wraparound, your classroom management, your restorative practices for which your teachers can get a booster on Wednesday, right? We want to take all of these practices, and I'm sure if I looked at your initiatives, Cynthia, Lori, Diana, if I looked at the initiatives in the schools that you serve, we could probably add to this list, right? But what we want to do is get to one framework where these things are strategies that are tools in our teachers and clinicians and support staff's toolkit to meet the needs of all students within a three-tiered model. The reason why I'm preaching and repeating in a broken record way, right, the need for MTSS is because research tells us if we really do it, it works, right? If we engage in MTSS, a three-tiered model, that medical model, we can absolutely scale our implementation of high-quality practices through a framework. It really helps us use data and practices to improve our systems over time to get to that socially and emotionally competent and academically achieving student. So let's use restorative practices as one example. I'm super glad that Jay is having a booster and that we, mentioned it at the beginning, because it's a nice example to help us think through how does this fit within the framework. So in PBIS world, right, we preach evidence-based classroom practice, right? Having a well-organized physical environment, establishing expectations. All the adults have to get on the same page, establish expectations, teach those expectations and rules and routines in the classroom level through the classroom matrix, engage in active supervision, encourage appropriate behavior of students by using positive specific praise, by acknowledging behavior when we see it, having a continuum of responses when we're not there yet, right? And then having ongoing opportunities to respond and academic achievement within our classrooms. I mentioned this idea of high demand with high support. That's the sweet spot that we want to get to, right? That's that when we talk restorative practices, I'm sure you guys have been through the training, you've seen this frame before. We don't want to neglect kids, but we also don't want to do it for them, right? Because the person who does the work does the learning. And we don't want to do unto, right? What you do for me, do with me. We often hear when we talk RP language, right? If I think about that through the classroom practices mindset, which is how do we engage in restorative practices within a PBIS frame, I'm really talking about this idea of relationship-driven work, right? That we need that high level of structure and support within the classroom, that we have high expectations, and that when our level of structure and support are not balanced, we tend to fall out of the with, right? We do 2 or we do 4, and sometimes we even stray into not, right, into that neglectful box. But if we think through the lens of the classroom practices that I just mentioned and align that with restorative practices, I'll give you one example, right? In the classrooms, if we're engaged in PBIS at Universal, when we establish at the beginning of the year our expectations with students, right, then they have skin in the game. It's not like we have a laminated poster up on our wall as teachers that kids walk into. Instead, we are designing what our agreements are as a classroom with students. That way, kids are given a voice. This is done at the school-wide level as well, right? When you brought back your expectations as a tier 1 team, you got feedback, and you continue to get feedback in an annual way, on an annual basis with your staff, so that they too have skin in the game. In fact, when we design our agreements together, it helps us build community, right? And when we have well-defined agreements, it provides us with structure and certainty. In fact, if we want to go next level, right, and really be intentional, when we design our classroom teaching matrix, I know that you guys know PBIS, right? You know that when we design a school-wide matrix, we put it in context. So if Lori was designing with her tier 1 team, the school-wide matrix, we have hallways, cafeteria, library, gymnasium, the different contexts within our school building. In the classroom, right, we often have during transitions, during group work, things that are applicable in that area. Think about the impact of if we were doing circles, right, at the universal level in our classroom, because we've been RP trained, what do our expectations look like within circles? What does it look like to be respectful? Is that speaking when you have the talking piece? Is that being respectful? So how can we layer in RP within this 3-tiered model so that RP isn't another thing, it's part of the broader framework? These are the types of tools that first help our adults see the alignment of our initiatives, and then later they help kids make sense of this. So it doesn't mean that we throw something out. Instead, it means we better align what we have. How do we take our classroom or teaching matrix and embed our RP practices so that we take a known and hook it to an unknown, or take 2 knowns and couple them together so they make sense for first adults and then kids. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I continue to just want to call attention to the different products. So as schools and districts and other organizations come to us with problems of practice, so you all, after this session, might send a question to Jay or myself around, that was great, Trish. Thanks for talking at us for 2 hours, but we still need X, Y, or Z answered, right? And then we bring those questions back to our Midwest team and the larger center team, and they continue to iterate and develop products to meet the needs. So we know that in some of our schools, right, that issue of opioids within our schools, right, have become a priority in many of our schools, not just high schools, right? And so how do we use the PBIS framework to address that within our schools? Or given what we know about trauma in the last 18 months, the additional trauma that we faced, how can we integrate trauma into our PBIS framework? And most recently, as we work to combat all of the social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health issues that has surfaced within the last 18 months, how can we continue to iterate upon our known, which is the PBIS framework, to meet the needs of the students who are coming back, such as, right, not just teaching what our expectations are, not just teaching what our rules and routines are, but actually teaching kids how coping strategies, social and emotional competencies within that PBIS framework, right? Because an interconnected system framework applies to all MTSS features, right? I'm not going to take you all the way back to one of our initial slides where we show the overlap between academic RTI and behavioral PBIS and where they meet, right, is MTSS. But each of them, as you may remember, have effective teams, the use of data, evidence-based practices, early access through screening, which doesn't have to be an official screener, and we should not be adding a screener if we haven't presently been implementing one, right? Instead, we should be using the data we have to screen for students. And then using progress monitoring for both fidelity and effectiveness of what we're doing, with ongoing job-embedded coaching and support for teachers. Because overall, the research says when we install, right, with fidelity, high quality, high fidelity installation of PBIS, we get improved student outcomes, reduced exclusionary discipline practices and disproportionality, and improved teacher outcomes. It's not right. It's not just about kids. It's also about serving the adults within our organization, because they have to be regulated and healthy to be able to meet the needs of students. So I mentioned RP, right? Here's how RP fits within the three-tiered model. Let's talk about trauma-informed practices as another example. I mentioned this earlier, right? We know that students who have 3 or more ACEs are 2.5 times more likely to fail a grade. Right? We've known that for a while. We also know that students with 3 or more ACEs are often more likely to be functioning below grade level, receive special ed services, and experience exclusionary discipline practices. We also know from the research, right, that students that have adverse childhood experiences often struggle to regulate their own emotions. And when they are not regulated, they do not have access to our curriculum, right? It impacts executive function. It impacts their ability to acquire language. All of these are brought on by trauma. In fact, right, let's reference our Maslow from earlier. If I am in fight, flight, or freeze, I am in survival, which is at the bottom part of the pyramid, right? Which means I am not, my cognitive ability is not available to me when I am dysregulated. In fact, one of my favorite visuals of this is this little child, right? Trapped. If this was my oldest, this would not have trapped her. She would have been able to get up the stairs. But most of us, if this is up, right, we don't have access to cognition. We are in survival mode related to Maslow, right? We have no access to our cognitive functioning. And we know that before pre-pandemic, roughly 1/3 of our students were coming to us with 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. Given what we know from the pandemic, these numbers are greatly increased as we enter this fall. But what we also know, when we think back to that Comer quote, right? No significant learning occurs without significant relationship. That to overcome trauma, because right? We don't just give up because we know that many of our kids come from trauma. We have to build resiliency. And we know that the single most common factor for children developing resiliency is at least one stable, committed relationship with a supportive parent, caregiver, or adult. It doesn't say teacher. It doesn't say principal. It doesn't say just mom or just dad or just, right? It says one significant adult. And for some of our kids, it's adults within our community organizations, it's adults within our school setting, right? But it's an adult that has a significant relationship, a supportive relationship, one that is high support and high demand, right? In fact, we were trained recently this last school year by Dr. Bruce Perry, where a lot of that brain research comes from. And his assertion was, because kids engage with the adults in their school environment on a daily basis, if they have strong, stable relationships within the school setting, they have a treatment-related level of support from that strong relationship. When I say that, I'm likening that to the treatment that you get if you send a child, right, to work with a counselor, who often they only see once a week or less, depending on your circumstances, whereas they see us in our school buildings every day, right? And given the amount of interaction that they have with us, if they have stable, committed relationships within our schools, they receive a treatment-related level of support when they have strong, committed relationships within our school buildings. When I think about trauma, especially, I think about having predictable, consistent, positive, and safe environments, which is really what PBIS does for us. When all the adults in our organization agree to what the expectations are, that makes us have a consistent environment, right? When we actively teach in an ongoing way, and we all engage kids in those high expectations with high levels of support, it becomes predictable for students and adults. When we point out when kids are getting it right, acknowledging positive behaviors, it creates a positive environment. And overall, having consistency among our adults, consistent practice, provides students with a level of safety and predictability, all of which are necessary for students who come from trauma backgrounds, all of which are provided when we install PBIS with Fidelity. I'm going to go back to that classroom practices. So overall PBIS, right, all the adults agree to what the practices are and actively teach them. But when we get to the level of classroom installation, when we truly install classroom practices with Fidelity, right, we did the crosswalk between RP and classroom practices. The same thing is applicable with trauma-informed practices, right? If when we walk into our classrooms, we have a well-organized, right, physical environment, it promotes safety because the kids can see the teacher no matter what the vantage point and vice versa. Kids feel safe when the adults can monitor them. When the teacher works with students to agree on the expectations and rules, right, then we provide consistency. We can teach in an active way, right, those social and emotional competencies to teach kids how to regulate. And by developing those social and emotional competencies with us, we strengthen those relationships that we've talked about being so necessary, right, for ongoing support. Again, if we continue through these different classroom practices, we see that each of them are highly aligned to trauma-informed. So again, I'm not asking you to take trauma-informed and replace PBIS any more than we ask you to replace PBIS with restorative. Instead, how can we be intentional with our adults so they see the alignment between the framework of PBIS and MTSS and these strategies that are tools for them to implement in their classroom? In fact, if we look to the work of Dunning, right, who's well known in that area of trauma-informed practice, we know that there's an alignment between the teaching matrix the physical environment, active supervision, and helping kids feel safe, right? They're supervised, they have common expectations, they have a well-organized classroom. It helps give them a feeling of safety. When we focus on active supervision, encourage appropriate behavior, and allow for different ways for kids to engage in our classroom, that helps us build relationships, which build trust, right? And I know that Jay and I have mentioned ad nauseum the need for relationships and trust in our classrooms, in our buildings, and across our community organizations. So again, not just returning to school during and after a crisis, right? But getting back to school after disruptions will give you real strategies dependent on your need. So as I'm asking you to go back to the basics and use data to inform your practices, whether it's school-wide practices, do we need to take a look at our school-wide matrix? I'm sure many of you have as you're getting ready to come back to school and you're talking about appropriate mask wearing, appropriate social distancing, etc., right? You're already embedding those, but it's not just about the expectations. It's about teaching those expectations and reinforcing those expectations, and then acknowledging them when you see them. So when we say go back to basics, right? It's really about identifying in your current context what your adults need, so that once you get them what they need, they can get kids what they need. So I mentioned reteaching, reminding and acknowledging at the school level, at the classroom level, to the best of our ability, focusing on positives, so acknowledging positive behaviors when we see them and avoiding punitive or punishment-based consequences, right? Getting to know our students, again, as we come back to the school year, we know that we have strategies in place every year, whether it's the fact sheet that we send home to gather more information about our students, whether it's about, I know in one district that I worked in last week, they were going to use the first 2 solid weeks of school, not to say that they weren't teaching academics, but they all agreed within their school and within their district to spend the first 2 weeks of school engaged in active relationship building, getting to know the kids through different strategies, and so that they develop those trusting relationships early on. As I mentioned, we're not asking you to screen if we haven't been screening before, but instead using data to look for signs that students and families might need additional help, continuing to re-engage those families as partners, and then again, I cannot mention enough, going back to the basics, because PBIS should look different this year based on what we learned from last year, but certainly we know that this year is going to look different, and so we need to go back to the basics and do what works. So I mentioned teaching social and emotional competencies. Much like I gave an example of RP, restorative practices, like what does being respectful, being responsible, being safe look like in circles? Here's how we might, if this is an edge of growth for our teams, right? If one of the edges of growth is our school-wide matrix, right? What are some ways that we can embed those social and emotional competencies within our school-wide matrix? Not just agree to them and put them on the matrix, but then actively teach them throughout the school year. I've linked within the PowerPoint a resource if this is an edge of growth. So as you guys look at your school-wide matrix and are working with your team and welcoming your staff back, if teaching social and emotionally competencies within a PBIS framework is an edge of growth for your teams, this hot linked resource will describe how staff can teach them, right? And recommendations on how we can tweak our current PBIS framework to support that social emotional competency inclusion. This is much like, I'm going to go back here really quickly. This is much like when we started adding to the school-wide matrix the teacher expectation. I'm sure many of you have those, right? When we know better, we do better, right? We know that many of our students are coming back and have increased need. So just like the year that we added teaching expectations, how might we embed social and emotional competencies? And again, we're not adding a new thing. Instead, we're taking our known thing, which is our matrix, either at the school-wide level or at the classroom level, and embedding those social and emotional competencies within that already known framework. So Lori, would you mind putting your voice in the room? Because I've already been talking way too much. When you think about your school-wide matrix, what are your 3 to 5 expectations?
In Newark, we show our pride by being responsible, respectful, safe, and part of a community.
Perfect. So is this one edge of growth that you or any of the other schools might consider layering into pride, right? What does pride look like when we're taking care of self?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a perfect spot to talk about self-care, right? And really helping our students understand the value in that. So I love that. And I love, you said earlier about adding circle in there, right? That is a common practice. Not necessarily in all of our buildings yet, but for the buildings that it is common practice, I love making that one of the locations or the settings to really be explicit about that expectation so that everybody's on the same page.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lori, for putting your voice in the room. So again, it's not doing something brand new, right? It's continuing to iterate on the known so that we don't feel overwhelmed. If we already have expectations at the school-wide level and at the classroom level, how do we tweak and iterate based on our data to continuously improve in a yearly basis? So either adding social and emotional competencies, adding restorative practices during circle time. How can we take the known and hook it? That's how we align our initiatives, right? That's how we make it make sense for adults so they can help make sense for kids. You could do the same thing if you have a social and emotional learning curriculum. So in our elementary buildings, we use, in my former district, we use second step. So we started mimicking the language of second step within the framework, right? Because second step was teaching some of those social, emotional, behavioral competencies. So we started mimicking that language. When we added social and emotional competencies, what they were learning within their second step lessons, we transferred that language into that context on our matrix, right? If you're not presently teaching a social and emotional learning curriculum, right, you have to figure out who, right? In our district, we had classroom teachers teaching social and emotional learning curriculum. We didn't have clinicians doing it because it needed to be part of our everyday practice and clinicians weren't available. We also have to consider, again, as we're thinking about this year and this context with these kids under these conditions, do we start with lesson 1 if we have social emotional learning curriculum in our school, or do we use our data to choose the lesson progression that best matches the kids as they're entering, right? We have to go back to the basics and also be really intentional about using data to inform the decisions that we make. So as we mentioned, right, I love, 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 love. I don't usually encourage stoplights because when I see stoplights, I think clip charts, right? Clip up, clip down, you're on the red, which is something we would never encourage. But I included this one because it was really about teaching kids, again, a strategy to self-regulate. So if we're on green, we're on the go, not green in the clip chart way, but green like I'm good, I'm in a good headspace, I am regulated, I am rocking, right? If I'm not quite there yet, if I need additional support, then I might teach kids that when I'm stuck, when I'm having trouble getting to my best work, what can I do? what do I know? What can I work with? What are my resources? How can I utilize my friends? How can I utilize my teacher? If I am red, if I am in the red, if I feel red, right, then one of the things I could teach students is taking one long deep breath, or belly breathing, or fill in the blank, right? Teaching kids different strategies, being able to be self-aware of where they are, and then have strategies to bring themselves into regulation. That's what we mean when we're talking about teaching social emotional competencies. What we hope to do, right, is to move from academics being over here, I'm backwards on my screen, I'm sure, and social and emotional being over here, right, to more of an interconnected framework. Because for those of you, and most of you have been at this for 5 or 10 or more years, right? We know that it's hard to tease apart behavior and academics. And we know that high quality practices work, whether it is behavior or academics. So when we look at that MTSS framework, when we think through this lens of a multi-tiered system of support for all, few, and some, we want to move away from separating out academics and non-academics, right? We want to give equal priority, partially because behavior, right, is a prerequisite to academics. I have to be regulated, I have to be engaged, I have to be open to learning. It's like Maslow, right? I have to have my needs met before I can get into cognition. So what we want to do is get so that when we think about social emotional behavioral, we think about it with the same lens that we think about academics. We have to engage in high quality practices at Universal, whether I'm teaching math or I'm teaching social emotional learning. We, as the adults who support adults, have to think about the ongoing job embedded supports that adults need to get here, right? In fact, right, we talked earlier about there's no quick fix, and we can't hire our way out of this, even though we have additional funds this year. We can't buy a new curriculum. We can't just train staff. Instead, we have to develop stakeholder teams that are representative of our groups. We have to have formalized processes that use data to inform our practices. We have to engage in ongoing job embedded professional development based on our data. And then we have to continuously problem solve with our teams. We have to use data, systems, and practices, right, to get to those improved outcomes. So at the school-wide level, we have to use data to inform our entry this year. We have to use data as we go back to the basics to shore up what we're doing and to iterate and refine it to meet the needs of the adults and kids who are entering. At every single tier of the pyramid and every step within this continuous improvement process, we have to use data. I'm going to pop all of these up. But one of the things I want to remind us of is that we have to be implementing all components of the 3-tiered model to get to those outcomes. We have to have teams. We have to have common expectations. We have to create a safe and consistent environment. We have to actively build the skills of our teachers and students. We have to approach our adults the same way we ask them to approach kids, right? We're going to assume positive intent and assume that it's a skill deficit, not a will deficit. All of us want to be successful, right? All of us want to be successful. We have to build our skills, whether we're adults or kids. We have to encourage through acknowledgement, positive behaviors. We have to prevent whenever possible and respond with a growth restorative mindset when kids and adults aren't there yet, and continuously use data around fidelity and outcomes to inform our practices this year. When I say data, you all did this last year, for goodness sakes, right? You didn't have as many office discipline referrals, so you had to use other types of data, whether that was how many kids were logging into their Zoom or their Google Meets, whether that was how many kids were requesting additional support from a nurse or a counselor, whether that was homework completion. You guys already had to get creative last year around data usage because the data that you had historically used wasn't the same data that you had available to you last year. This year, we're going to have to continue to innovate, right? So how can we use academic data? How can we use discipline data, right? That data, attendance data, perception data, those are data points that we've used historically. What other data points that will you continuously use? How can we start to screen from multiple viewpoints this year? Which of these data points are you not currently using, but you might need to use given your current context of this school year? Ultimately, we're going to continue to use the same process, as I mentioned before, for teaching academics as we did behavior, right? We're gonna tell kids, show kids, practice it. We're gonna I do, we do, you do, a gradual release, right? And then as we release, we're gonna monitor and adjust while we stay consistent this year. Lori and I were talking when she so graciously put her voice in the room about what this might look like. Now, this doesn't align with pride, but here are some examples. Many of our schools have being safe, being responsible, being respectful. If we're going to target social and emotional skills for being safe, that might look like I tell an adult when I'm worried about a friend. If I'm thinking about being responsible and self-care, right? I'm going to check in with my feelings during the day. That's not just for kids, right? We should be preaching these with adults too, right? It is responsible to take care of self, check in with feelings, and tell someone when I'm worried about a friend. So examples of how we might embed these in our already existing expectations. Consider incorporating those pro-social skills within the teaching matrix, especially the classroom matrix. It's, specific behaviors are important. They're necessary, like throwing away paper, using the right side of the stairwell, keeping our mask over our nose and our mouth. Those are specific behaviors we want to see. But pro-social skills, especially given our current context, are equally important this year, right? So encouraging others, telling peers they did a good job. How can we layer these into our expectations? But when we go back to basics, y'all have to think about your context, right? So based on what you know about your school setting and your staff, how can you prioritize? How can you identify lessons either within your current curriculum or strategies and skills that you've already used, like restorative practices, like circles? How can you use the known to address what your kids and your staff are currently struggling with? How can you add to the matrix? We've given several examples, right? How can you embed restorative practices such as circles? How can you instruct, or how can you add social and emotional competencies? How can you continue to use these same good practices with your adults? Because if you model this with them during their PD, during their staff meetings, during their grade level meetings, the more times they see this in practice, the more likely they are to replicate those behaviors back in their classroom settings. Another way that we might embed these within a school-wide matrix. Some examples of what this might look like. This one is Roar, right? Out of one of our schools that has a lion as a mascot. So what this might look like at lunch is inviting those to sit with us if they're alone. Or being responsible might look like using my breathing techniques. But if we have them on the matrix, right, we can't just have them there. We have to actively teach them and reteach them and acknowledge them when we see them. So we still have our expectations, right? Whether they be roar or pride or be respectful, be responsible, be safe. We still have our natural context, the location that this is occurring. We still have rules or specific behaviors, but we're also layering in those additional social and emotional competencies. Same thing can be used if we're intervening related to bullying, right? Expectations, context, rules or specific behaviors. In recent years, right, technology, even before the pandemic, was problematic in some of our schools. The implications of social media would be brought back into the school building. It intensified in some of our schools last year. So again, thinking through the lens of technology is not just when we're remote, right? We engage with technology every day of our life, even if we're not actively using technology in our classrooms. Kids are going home and engaging in technology. So just reminding kids of what this looks like and feels like, right, within our expectations. So back to Roar, you know, teaching kids that words matter. Frankly, we need to teach a lot of adults this when they're engaging with social media as well, right? Words matter. Reflect before you post. So again, we still have our expectations. We still have our natural context. This is technology. But then what are those specific behaviors and skills? I'm going to pop these up. So please be reminded, right? We get our expectations. Everyone does that. Then we have our kickoff. We're usually super awesome at the kickoff at the beginning of the year. We all teach the expectations, but we have to have continuous teaching. We don't just teach math on the first day or the first week or first 2 weeks of school. So we have to have ongoing direct instruction, and it has to be data driven, right? How do we align what we're teaching with what our data says we need? How do we embed it in the curriculum? I'm going to show you an example that I'm sure you've seen before, but certainly this year we just need to be mindful of this as we re-enter. How can we do boosters based on our data? And how do we make it continuously visible? How can we take our data that informed our decision to teach this progression of lessons and then show our data afterwards to see if it had the intended impact? So when we go back to basics, I want us to again consider relationships. Can you give me a thumbs up if you in your school, your setting has ever done this activity? This is a school that posted the picture of every student in the school. Oh, I got a couple thumbs up. This is a super powerful activity, right? You post all the pictures and then the staff put a dot on kids that they have a relationship with, not just know what they look like and know their name, but have a relationship with. And if you've done this activity, right, you already know of the impact, because you'll have kids that have a lot of dots and some kids that have none, right? And it's a beautiful visual to help us remind us of the importance of relationships and how some kids have incredibly strong networks and some kids within our school settings have no significant relationships. Now, while we will not necessarily be shaking hands, and while these pictures will be masked this year, right, we can still be creative and innovative and how we engage students from the time they enter our buildings throughout our day this year. In fact, if you've seen let me back up. This gentleman in my right corner who had an individual handshake. If you haven't seen that video, someone remind me, prompt me before we leave, and I'll find the YouTube link and send it to you. This is a teacher who's created entry handshakes, specific entry handshakes for every student who walks into his classroom. And obviously, as you can see, had to innovate that process when they came back to in person, right? As you can see, they both have masks on now, and their handshakes, if you will, do not involve actual touching, but he still has an individualized greeting, developing relationship and rapport with each student that walks in his building, in his classroom, right? So, as I mentioned, if you are not screening yet, you are not going to start a new universal screener, right? But if you are using a universal screener, it will be important to install that during the first few weeks of school to get your data to identify students very early who need higher levels of support, especially those that are internalizers. If you are not presently engaged in a screener, don't do a request for proposals, don't try to find one. Instead, identify the data. And that was we had a slide about that a couple screens ago, right? Identify the data points that you're going to use to screen kids, to identify kids, whether that be surveys, whether that be check-in documents with kids. What are you going to use to identify kids who need additional levels of support when they're in person? So another link that we have offered as a resource within today's materials is how do we use systematic screeners for behavior. If you already have a screener, then this will be important for your practice. If you don't have a screener, you're not reading this right now, right? You'll wait till we get through this year together, and then you'll use this resource. But if you do have a screener, and this is an edge of growth for how you use that data and how you make decisions that get to kids additional levels of support beyond tier 1, then this might be a helpful resource to your practice. As I mentioned, if you don't have one, you're not starting one. Instead, you might survey students and or their families. I know some of you guys did this while you were remote, right? You had a simple Google form that they filled out that requested additional support or told you if they were struggling, but you might also identify other data points. If you are using a screener, get guidance, right? Get guidance for when kids have to quarantine. Get guidance for how you might share and continue to work with youth and family. And then let's think about supports. So all, few, some, all in person and remote. When we all know that we might have some remote learning iterations this year again, right? We're not ruling anything out this year. So we've continued to supply additional supports for remote instruction because we just don't know. One thing that we've been taught over the last 18 months is that you have to prepare for the worst and hope for the best, right? So we absolutely need to teach, prompt, and acknowledge positive behaviors. We need to, at the start of each activity, teach or pre-correct for the target expectation. We absolutely, if you haven't yet, I'm sure you have, need to take a look at our school-wide matrix, have ongoing conversations with our teachers about their in-class matrix, embed our social, emotional, behavioral objectives in the same way that we do our academic objectives, whether that be marker board configuration, embedding this in our lesson planning, and then monitor. How do we use our ongoing data to plan better, to offer supports to adults and kids? And once we've done a lot of work at tier 1, right? How do we continue to iterate beyond tier 1? So whether it's a screener, whether it's data from office discipline referrals or teacher recommendation or family recommendation, how do we go back to basics and start using check-in, check-out as our tier 1, our top of tier 1, bottom of tier 2, right? Kids who are not being met at tier 1 are then very quickly installed in check-in, check-out. And for students who are engaged in check-in, check-out for a period of time and using our data rules, if they need additional levels of support, we layer on social and academic instructional groups, right, at tier 2, but we keep that daily progress report. We keep check-in, check-out. We just layer on. They're still getting access to universal. They are still getting access to check-in, check-out. Instead, we're layering on SAGE groups, right? In fact, if we had a coping skills group, we might start getting intentional with our daily progress report to embed some of the skills they're learning in that SAGE group within our DPR card. And then thinking through our groups. So I've spent the bulk of our time together today talking tier 1, because that's where we should spend the bulk of our time. But as we go up the pyramid, right, as we add additional layers of support, we want to be intentional about the types of groups we offer beyond tier 1. And how do we use what we learned in tier 1, our data from tier 1, to inform the types of group that we need at tier 2. So next steps for you all and for your teams, right? Taking care of self, deciding what you are already doing well that you should continue doing, and then what iterations are you going to make on your practices to improve based on the school year that you're going to walk into. But please, 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 don't add new. Don't add a new screener. Don't add new curriculum. Don't add new. You absolutely have to examine current practice first. So I think one of the most powerful resources that I'm sharing today, right, is the Integrated Tiered Fidelity Inventory Companion Guide. You know that there are many products that have been put out by the center that help us think through TFI, right? Tiered Fidelity Inventory. Are we doing what we said we're going to do around tier 1? So is our team representative? Do we have parents? Do we have community members? Do we have students? If not, then let's go into the guide and think about what are the strategies that we could install using either the Integrated Tiered Fidelity Guide or the Cultural Responsive Field Guide, which is another support for TFI linked in this document. How could we use these resources to build our team? Or how could we use these resources to get feedback from our families, right? As we think through the TFI, which is, did we do what we say we're going to do? Where we have work to do, resources like the Integrated Tiered Fidelity Guide, as well as the Culturally Responsive Field Guide, et cetera, would be helpful after we identify components of tier 1 that we need to shore up, if you will. Here's that initiative inventory that I referenced at the beginning. And I had, I mentioned, this is linked actually in the PowerPoint. This might be helpful for your tier 1 team to think about for this year. So at the school level, right? And what I would replace in the second column is your school, right? If you were doing this as a school as opposed to a whole district, then you would name the initiative and then how this connects to your school mission. Identify what persons are involved in that implementation. What do you expect to be your outcome? What's your evidence that that outcome is happening, right? How are you supporting this in time and funds, et cetera? How are you measuring what you did, you're saying you're doing? And what ongoing support do you have for adults? So can I get someone I haven't heard from to give me an example of one initiative? Put your voice in the room. One initiative that you are presently engaging in your school building. You can either provide it in chat or come off mute. One initiative that you presently have.
At Red Creek, at Kyler Elementary, they have a RAMS recognition program where teacher, because it's elementary, puts in a little ticket for a student, and they have it set up now. It's electronic, so that the parent immediately gets an email so that that step is taken care of. So they know their kid got a RAMS recognition that day.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for putting your name in the, or for your voice in the room. So you have an acknowledgement system. That's what I hear you saying, right? I have to imagine that that's aligned to your mission as a school, right? Acknowledging students' appropriate behavior. Teachers are involved, kids are involved, parents are involved, administrators are involved, right? Like you guys are all working together as a team. What is your expected outcome? I would imagine it's improved student outcomes, right?
Yeah, improved student behavior, less referrals. Yep.
And you're monitoring that. I just heard you say the magic word, right? You monitor that through referral data, right?
Yes.
And I would imagine that one commitment that I already heard was time, right? There was the time to construct the electronic system. There was the time to issue the acknowledgement. There was, right? So that's one commitment that you've made.
Yeah.
How are you monitoring fidelity?
Actually, every classroom that gets 20 RAMS recognitions for the month then gets a classroom incentive. So that way it's supposed to make teachers want to do it and have kids ask their teachers about it if they're kind of not doing it.
Oh yeah, it's super great to like get kids getting competitive, right? To have a group contingency, right? Because we should have multiple types of acknowledgement, individual acknowledgements, intermediate acknowledgements, group contingencies, right? That just keeps us all honest. So you could probably go through in your building, right? And lay out the different initiatives. What I'm suggesting is this might be a helpful activity this year to consider what we're going to continue doing, what we're going to stop doing, and what we're going to tweak, right? You notice I didn't say what we're going to start doing. We're not starting new stuff, right? While we're already overwhelmed. What are we going to continue doing because it's working for us and we have the data to support it? What are we going to stop doing because we don't have data to support that it works? And what are we going to tweak? That's what we should be doing with an initiative inventory like this. This is just one tool that helps us think through those initiative inventories, right? And frankly, if you were going to start a new initiative, which I'm saying don't do, but let's say we make it through the first semester and we're in person and things are going well. And either in planning for next year, right? Planning for next year when we're adding additional initiatives, in addition to looking at our current initiatives that you just created in that initiative alignment activity, then you want to think through before we add something else. I told you to keep doing what you're doing that works, stop doing stuff that isn't, and tweak stuff that, has some leading indicators but's not there yet. But before you add a new one next year, you want to think about what is your current capacity? What is the evidence that the thing we're going to add to this list, this few but mighty list, is evidence-based, could be used in our setting, right? It could have a lot of evidence, but if we don't have the capacity to implement, it's not usable. What supports, like ongoing PD, ongoing coaching, would we need? Who is it designed for? And how does it fit with what we currently do? So this year, we're encouraging you, keep doing what's working, get rid of what's not, tweak what we have leading data to say could be improved. When we get ready to add next year, we have to consider all these components before we add another thing. Instead, this year, we're going to build from our current practice. We're going to use things like the school-wide matrix and add restorative practices, or the school-wide or classroom matrix and add social and emotional behavioral competencies. We're going to resist the temptation while we're overwhelmed beyond measure to add new practices without first considering how we can improve what we got. We're going to assess our current reality. We're going to decide whether what we're doing is meeting the needs of all, some, and few, adults and kids. And then if we identify edges of growth, things that we have to add later, not now, later, in addition to thinking through the initiative inventory, we might want to think about an intervention map, another resource I've added based on the needs that Jay identified as we think through this alignment of initiatives. So we have to consider our current initiatives, what's going well, what we need to tweak, etc., as we identify gaps or things we need to iterate on. Something like resource mapping might be super helpful. So at tier 2, do we all have check-in, check-out? And are we doing check-in, check-out with Fidelity? We have to be doing the things we're already doing with Fidelity before we add another thing, right? If we have check-in, check-out with Fidelity and we have groups running, do we have the types of groups running that are meeting the needs of the kids and the needs they're showing us this year, right? And are we actively monitoring those groups aligned to, does it align to our need? Does it have a facilitator? Are we collecting data on it? Are kids improving in that group? Et cetera, right? We should take each thing that we're doing through this lens of, does it meet our need? Does it have the support that we need? Are kids benefiting from the practice? So this activity will be embedded in the workbook that I'll share with Jay as one of the resources available to your teams as you think through tier 2 especially, right? So after we've spent all of first semester working on tier 1, making certain that it's really well aligned with our current context this year, and we continue to layer on levels of support, how can we use our data in second semester to inform our practices? So what do our kids tell us we need? And what additional supports might we need to layer on? So I'm hopeful that in our time today, you've heard me say ad nauseum. So you hear my quiet, soothing voice in your head over the next few weeks, right? Do a few things well, a few, right? We make you limit your expectations to 3 to 5. I want you to limit, right, what you're working on these next few weeks to a few, but do them well. Use data to inform your ongoing work. Now is not the time for new initiatives. And take care of yourself. Take care of yourself. Take care of yourself. As a reminder, I would be remiss if I did not mention that our leadership forum is online again this year. So you don't have to travel to come hear amazing messages of support for how you might create a context for every student to have and the educator to have their needs met. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen to see if there are questions that I might respond to or additional resources that you have need of. And I'm going to stop recording so you can put a question in the room. It won't be recorded.